Welcome to the brief, quick edition of the Wars of American History. First of all, I want to just go over this concept of what war is. According to the United States Constitution, a war is only a war if the Congress of the United States issues a formal declaration of war. This has only happened 5 times in American history. Generally speaking, though, we talk about 11 major military conflicts in American history. And first of all, there's obviously the War of American Independence. Did not have a formal declaration of war because the declaration of war by the Continental Congress was by a non-recognized nation state. However, we do know that the Second Continental Congress issued a Declaration of Independence, which therefore, because the British government did not acquiesce to the demands of the Second Continental Congress, became essentially a declaration of war. When we study war, when we study almost anything, personally I look for rubrics and themes, and I do this so that you can kind of train your brain to kind of look for certain key facts in any topic. So when I teach the concept of war, specifically American history and American wars, I expect my students to be able to identify the president during the war, who the military leaders were, who the foreign power that the war was against, the stated reason for conflict. And the reason I use the adjective stated reason is because often the stated reason is not necessarily the real reason for the conflict. And then what's the resolution or end of the conflict? So, in the American Revolution, I like to teach it about 2 or 3 phases to the war. The American War of Independence started because of those troublemakers in Boston, and so that's where you saw a lot of the early conflict. In fact, conflict before the Declaration, with the battles of Lexington and Concord. The British strategy was to cut New England off from the other colonies and therefore contain the troublemakers in New England. The most important battle from an American perspective that thwarted this was the Battle of Saratoga, where the General Burgoyne from the British forces had come down from Canada, and there was going to be a pincer maneuver where British forces in red there coming from Canada and some others coming up from New York eventually would cut New England off. So therefore the success of Horatio Gates and even Benedict Arnold and General Lincoln, that their success was really the most important part of the first phase of the American War of Independence. Here you can see dates going along with all of the rest of the battles. You can notice a pattern that, generally speaking, it goes from north to south, from earliest to latest. So essentially, the second phase of the American War of Independence was essentially a war of attrition, where the British continued to work their way down especially the northeast coast of the United States, what's now the United States, and General Washington essentially was fighting at delaying maneuvers. He did not completely gut and run and abandon the North. He fought a series of delaying conflicts along the coast, continuing to lose, but continuing to keep the army together. The emotional victory that he had was that Christmas Day battle against the Hessians at the Battle of Trenton, where he was just trying to give the Americans a sense of hope. And then there's the Valley Forge winter, where von Steuben comes and helps start it to train the soldiers. Washington has to take disciplinary actions with the soldiers because of desertion, and they're in Valley Forge because the British blocked them from getting to Philadelphia, and that's certainly the low point of the war. The French do send supplies, and more importantly, they send a fleet under de Grasse and an army under Rochambeau. The army stays in Rhode Island and pretty much is bottled necked there by the British fleet, And Degrassi's French fleet kind of goes down to the Bahamas and the Caribbean and is afraid of engaging the much larger and more powerful British fleet. Then this is the Southern campaign, and you can see the dates are a little bit later. Nathaniel Greene from Rhode Island, being the top commander in the South, was fighting really a guerrilla war against the British. So the turning point in the war, then this third and final phase, is that General Cornwallis goes to fight down in the South. He figures that there are more loyalists down there. He'll have a better time and more success. And when he goes down to the South, a bunch of things happen all at once. General Washington decides to bring the Northern Army down to aid the South and maybe even corner Cornwallis between the two armies. Rochambeau, the French army, leaves Rhode Island, joins Washington, and comes down as well. So you have these two northern armies, the French and the American armies, and the American Army of the South meeting all up at Yorktown, essentially. Yorktown is inside of a river, a salt fresh mix river, and essentially part of the Chesapeake Bay. And at this point, the British realize that they're going to be trapped at Yorktown. Cornwallis calls the British fleet to get him out of there. The British fleet enters the waters, and the pivotal moment and decision is Degrassi now jumps out of the Caribbean and out of hiding, sails north, and bottlenecks the British inside of the bay. So now Cornwallis's army is surrounded. He has two armies to the north of him, one army to the south of him, and the French fleet blocking his escape. He has to surrender, and the Americans are granted independence. So who was the president during the American Revolution? There was no president, but the president of the Second Continental Congress was John Hancock. George Washington is the most famous American military leader. He was helped by the volunteer, the Marquis de Lafayette, who, while French, was part of the American army. The foreign power being fought was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and the stated reason was independence, and it was eventually, the independence was recognized by the Treaty of Paris in 1783. In this final picture, you can see the surrender of Cornwallis's sword. Cornwallis pretended to be sick and therefore had his deputy turn over his sword to General Washington, and so therefore General Washington refused to accept the sword and sent his deputy instead. This is what the United States then looks like after the treaty. The problem is that neither the United States nor the British followed the Treaty of Paris. From the American perspective, the British did not withdraw their troops from the Northwest Territory, and they did not stop the impressment of U.S. sailors. From the British perspective, the treaty said that the United States was going to pay compensation to the loyalists who lost property and fled to Canada mostly, and the United States did not follow that treaty obligation. So, what's going on in the War of 1812? In the War of 1812, most of the conflict was in the north. There, it makes sense because that's where there's territorial contact between the British and the Americans. The Americans invaded Canada and were repulsed. The Canadian / British then came down, and there was conflict there as well. The most important northern battle was actually a naval battle. It was the Battle of Lake Erie, in which the U.S. Leader, Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, was able to get into the Lake Erie with ships that he built and transported and dropped into the lake, and they were able to successfully defeat the British naval forces in Lake Erie. The British, having been thwarted militarily from coming down themselves, sent supplies to the Native Americans and encouraged the Native Americans to attack the United States. The largest battle was the Battle of Tippecanoe. The American leader was William Henry Harrison, and when he ran for president later, his campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too. The British then, having been thwarted in the north, made two incursions into the central part of the United States from the sea. Neither one was really meant to land and occupy. It was more to land and burn, to slash and burn. The Battle of Fort McHenry outside of Baltimore is probably most famous for the prisoner who was taken as a spy, and that is, of course, Francis Scott Key. So while he was in the prison ship, he penned what becomes the national anthem of the United States. Having been thwarted at the Battle of Fort McHenry, British forces later attack up the river and then across land and attack Washington, D.C., the capital itself, and in fact burn the White House. While the White House was burned, Dolly Parton was able to save the famous painting of George Washington, and it was, while it was painful for those involved, it didn't have a strategic influence. In fact, ultimately people negotiated the Treaty of Ghent and the war was over, but because of the lack of effective and immediate communication, the Battle of New Orleans happened after the treaty was already signed. And in the bottom picture there, you can see General Andrew Jackson leading the U.S. forces to repulse the British attack on New Orleans. At the top is the siege of Fort McHenry, and on the top left is Francis Scott Key. And on the bottom, you can see Dolly commanding the collection of the painting and everything else she was going to take out of the White House. So the President of the United States during the War of 1812 was James Madison. The most famous military leaders on the American side was Jackson, William Henry Harrison, and Oliver Hazard Perry. Of course, they were fighting the British again, and for this reason, the war is often called the Second War of American Independence. The stated reason for the conflict was the failure of both sides to abide by the terms of the previous treaty, and it ended with the Treaty of Ghent. There in that right picture, you can see Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry transferring command to a new flagship when his flagship was under attack. The next war in American history is the Mexican-American War. What makes this one different is that this is the first war in which the United States is the aggressor and going outside of the borders of the United States. Yes, there had been earlier extraterritorial attacks, for example, when Jefferson sent the Marines to the Barbary Coast. However, this is a full-fledged war. On the right there, you can see the general battle plan. The President of the United States at the time was James K. Polk. He had promised a lot of expansion. He had promised when he ran for president, he promised he would accept the annexation of Texas as an American state. He would declare war on Mexico, and that he would, and his slogan was 54-40 or fight, that he would figure out what becomes known as the Oregon-Canadian border, and his original goal was much more aggressive than what he settled for. The stated reason for the conflict is that there were American soldiers who were attacked by British soldiers. Now, by Mexican soldiers. And the problem with that is that where that conflict happened, the conflict definitely happened, but it was in disputed territory. It was in between the Nueces and the Grande River. The Americans had said that the Rio Grande was the border, and the Texans the Texans and the Americans said that the Rio Grande was the border, but the Mexicans were under the assumption that the Nueces River was the border. So the conflict happened in a no man's land, and that's what led this young congressman on the right there, named Abraham Lincoln from the state of Illinois, to issue one of my favorite pieces of political dialogue in American history, what's known as the Spot Resolution. Show me the spot where American blood was shed on American soil. Regardless, the United States declared war without a reason, and here's a closer up image of the battle plans. Kearny went west to seize California. John C. Fremont beat him to it and declared the independence of the Bear Republic. Most interestingly to me is that Wool and Taylor, and that's the picture of Zachary Taylor, attacked directly from Texas south into Mexico. Essentially, it was a distraction because the real invasion route was an amphibious assault led by Winfield Scott across the Caribbean to attack Veracruz and then march west to Mexico City. The Mexican-American War, therefore, was fought during the presidency of James K. Polk. The main military leaders were Scott, Taylor, and Kearny. The foreign power was Mexico. The stated reason was the Thornton Affair, that conflict that happened in no man's land, and it was ended by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where the United States was in a much more powerful position, and the Mexicans therefore gave up what was called and is called the Mexican Cession, leading to a reduction of about a third of Mexico's territory and a massive increase in American territory. This general concept of America spreading out from coast to coast, as you know, is known as manifest destiny. This is what the United States looks like now after the Mexican-American War. Eventually, that little sliver in the bottom left-hand corner, the Gadsden Purchase, is taken as well, with the threat of a second Mexican-American War. Which brings us to the Uncivil War. The man on the right needs no introduction. The President of the United States during the United States Civil War was, of course, James Buchanan. What? James Buchanan? When President Lincoln was elected president, there was a much longer lame duck period, and the South started to secede from the Union because Lincoln was elected, but Lincoln was not the president. The Civil War started during the presidency of James Buchanan. The military leaders, probably Grant's the most famous. We'll talk about a couple of others. There is no foreign power because the United States does not recognize the South, the Confederate States of America, as a foreign power, although the British did get involved and tried to help the South for a bit. The stated reason, or the espoused reason for the conflict, is states' rights, but we all know that what it was really being fought over was the institution of slavery. This is a battle plan. This is called the Anaconda Plan. It was designed by the same Winfield Scott. This is a much more accurate photo for the time period. The earlier photo I used for the Mexican-American War showed him far too old. The plan that he drew up was called the Anaconda Plan, and like an anaconda snake, the North was going to squeeze the South. There was going to be a blockade off the coasts, and then split Texas essentially away from the rest of the South by seizing control of the Mississippi, and then just squeeze the South until they capitulate. This is how it played out. Farragut, the naval officer, did seize New Orleans and started working up the Mississippi. And after a couple of battles in Tennessee, General Grant did begin the assault on the Mississippi River Valley and started working his way down the Mississippi. I'm going to pause there and go over to the Northeast. In the North, you can see that cluster of U.S. generals. The first U.S. general was McClellan. He was later replaced by Pope. Pope was replaced by McClellan again. Later, Hooker, Burnside, and Meade all take turns leading the armies of the Potomac against the man in the bottom right-hand corner, General Robert E. Lee. Eventually, when Grant is able to get the U.S. forces from the Mississippi River and the siege of New Orleans to meet at Vicksburg, it becomes known as the Siege of Vicksburg. Grant is called east to take control of the armies of the Potomac, and he begins his war of attrition against, and total warfare is what the theory is called, against Robert E. Lee. And then finally, as he's closing in on Lee, William Tecumseh Sherman, who Grant had left in charge of the armies of the West, begins his invasion of the South and his march to Atlanta, and then his march to Savannah and to the sea. In fact, the Anaconda Plan worked, and the United States defeated the Confederate States of America. The presidents of the United States, therefore, were Buchanan, who did nothing, Lincoln for the majority of the war, and then just a month or two or three before the end of the war, Lincoln was assassinated, and President Johnson, therefore, was the president at the end of the Uncivil War. The American military leaders were Winfield Scott. He resigned and retired very early because of his advanced age. And as I said already, McClellan, Pope, McClellan, Hooker, Burnside, I believe is the correct order, and then Meade from the Battle of Gettysburg, and eventually Grant. And there is no foreign power, as we said, and Grant eventually gets Lee to surrender unconditionally, and that hence the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant, mouthful there, and that is signed at Appomattox Courthouse. This is what the United States looked like during the Uncivil War. And a couple of decades later, the United States begins the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War occurred during the presidency of William McKinley. The military leaders we'll talk about, I think, in the next slide or so. The foreign powers, obviously, Spain. And I'd like to start here with the stated reason of the conflict. The stated reason of the conflict is the sinking of the United States ship Maine. The USS Maine was in a port call in Havana, Cuba, and mysteriously exploded. We think nowadays, there was probably, it was a mechanical failure that led to the explosion in the steam room. But at the time, Americans felt that Spain must have booby-trapped or bombed the ship. There are other theories that the Cuban nationalists had bombed the American ship in order to make it look like the Spanish had done it, because the Cubans were in the midst of rebelling against the Spanish themselves. The United States' interest in there was, well, at face value, they said that they were interested in protecting the rights of Cubans. However, there was also the issue of territorial expansion. The United States had tried to purchase and take over Cuba approximately 3 times before in history. One time when it came the closest, what blocked the annexation of Cuba was the fact that people were afraid of Cubans because they were Catholic. We don't want those Catholics in this country. And then during the time of William McKinley, there is the time of what we call U.S. imperialism, and the United States is going out and pushing and expanding its sphere of influence, particularly in the Pacific, but we wanted to expand our influence in the Caribbean as well. Well, I want to start in the top off center there. Those 2 men, Pulitzer and Hearst, were owners of newspapers, and they used their platform of their newspapers to do what is known now as yellow journalism, propaganda. They drummed the drums of war, and when the Maine was not attacked, but exploded, it was they that started the slogan of "Remember the Maine, remember the Maine." The irony is that now good journalism receives the Pulitzer Prize, and that certainly wasn't the case in the Spanish-American War. There were 2 theaters in the Spanish-American War. On the left, not the top commander, but the most famous officer in the United States forces was the governor of New York, or perhaps he was the police commissioner of New York at the time. He resigned his jobs in New York and created a volunteer unit who went down, and they fought in the hills of eastern Cuba, and their unit's known as the Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. And it was an ugly conflict down there. The temperature was warm, and there were mosquitoes everywhere, which then, when Teddy Roosevelt later becomes president of the United States, it was his experience with mosquitoes and malaria that when he was building the Panama Canal that led to the draining of a lot of swamps and attacks on medical attacks on trying to defeat malaria. The other theater in the Pacific was led by Admiral Dewey. He took his United States fleet and he bottled up the Spanish fleet inside of Manila Bay, sunk essentially the entire Spanish fleet, with 1 U.S. casualty who died not from combat but sunstroke. So the president was William McKinley. The famous leaders were Admiral Dewey and Rough Rider leader Teddy Roosevelt. The foreign power was Spain. The stated reason for the conflict was the sinking of the Maine. The treaty ended with the Treaty of Paris of 1898, in which case the United States was given Puerto Rico, as well as Guam, Saipan, and the Mariana Islands, and the entire Philippine archipelago. The one thing we did not, quote-unquote, get was Cuba. We demanded, whatever your word choice is, Cuban independence. Cuba became its own country, but the Platt, P-L-A-T-T, amendment said the United States has the right to intercede in Cuba whenever it wants. That's what the map of the United States looked like at the end of the Spanish-American War. World War I occurred in 1914 for most of Europe, but it did not have American involvement until a couple of other incidents, including the German spies exploding munitions factories in New Jersey, the sinking of the USS Lusitania, as well as the Zimmerman telegram. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on World War I or World War II because I have separate PowerPoints on those that I'll be happy to share with you at another point. Very briefly, though, there were the Triple Entente, England, France, and Russia, who fought against the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which later becomes Turkey. The French and the British did not like Russia, but they only used Russia to, as you can see in the map, surround the Central Powers. When Russia eventually is knocked out of the war, that's approximately the same time the United States joins the war and allows President Wilson to use the slogan of making the world safe for democracy, because the British, the French, and the Americans were all democracies, and Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire at that point were all absolute monarchies. So the president was Woodrow Wilson. The military leader of the United States was John Blackjack Pershing. The foreign powers were the Central Powers I just listed. The stated reason for the conflict was the Lusitania and the Zimmerman telegram. They really didn't talk much about the munitions factories explosions, which in my opinion were more legitimate reasons for the declaration of war. And the entire war ended with the Treaty of Versailles, which was negotiated upon Wilson's 14 points. However, the United States did not sign the treaty and therefore signed bilateral treaties later with the belligerents. That picture there is Woodrow Wilson issuing a joint speech to a joint session of Congress in which he called on the Congress to declare war, which of course they did. World War II, similarly, as I just said, I have a separate PowerPoint which I'd be happy to share and go over, but very briefly from the European perspective, similar to World War I, there was the Allies that were Britain, France, Russia, and then there were and others, particularly Poland, because that's the what started that war was the German invasion of Poland, and then the instead of calling them the Central Powers in this conflict, they're called the Axis powers, and it is Germany, Italy, and Japan in the Far East. Germany, quickly using blitzkrieg strategies and superior weaponry, quickly expanded and took over. France went right around the Maginot Line and then worked their way east and attacked the Russians after the Battle of Britain failed. And then eventually the United States gets involved. The United States and British and all of the Allied forces land on the beaches of Normandy and start to push the Germans back. After the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans had no chance and were forced to surrender on May 8th, 1945. Just prior to that, Hitler had committed suicide, and so Admiral Donitz of the German Navy offered the surrender. In the Far East, the war, as you know, started for the Americans when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. It took the United States a little bit of time to recover from that, and this is where the conspiracy theories play in, all 4 Pacific aircraft carriers were not in port, so it would have been much different had those aircraft carriers been sunk. The United States did get taken over on the Aleutian Islands, which is not as well known of a fact. The United States started its island hopping strategy across the Pacific, working its way west. The first pivotal battle was the Battle of Midway, and once that Japanese fleet was blocked, at the very least, it allowed the United States to then work southwest across the islands, up eventually to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, which put us in air range of the home islands of Japan, and ultimately President Truman made the decision to drop the 2 atomic bombs, which forced the unconditional surrender of Japan to only the United States, and that famous scene of General Douglas MacArthur receiving the surrender, and the infamous radio message by Emperor Hirohito that he is not a god. So World War II, the presidents of the United States were FDR and Harry S. Truman after FDR passed away. The military leaders of the United States in the European theater were Bradley, Patton, and the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight David Eisenhower. In the West, the land commander, the Army commander, was Douglas MacArthur, and the naval commander was Admiral Nimitz. The foreign powers were the Axis powers. The stated reason what got the United States involved in the war was the sinking of, or the attacks on the fleet at Pearl Harbor. That caused the United States to declare war on Japan. Japan then insisted that the Allies, their allies, who are called the Axis, declare war on the United States. So Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and then the United States returned the favor. Hitler famously said that now the sleeping giant, or the sleeping lion, has been woken. While that is the American reason for the war was actually started because of, as I alluded to earlier, the German invasion of Poland and the violation of Belgian neutrality later. The European theater ended on May 8th, 1945, and the Pacific theater, it ended on August 15th, 1945. The next major conflict in American history is just that. It's a conflict, sometimes called a police action. It's not a war. There was not an American declaration of war. There was, however, a United Nations declaration of intervention to the defense of South Korea because of the North Korean invasion. This all falls under the general theory of domino theory that President Truman had begun, and President Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon all followed as well. The idea that we have to stop communism's spread wherever it is, no matter how relatively minor those countries are to the American interests at the time being, we need to stop communism everywhere. And so when North Korean communists attacked South Korean non-communists, the United States, through the UN, got involved. Essentially, there had been this line partitioning the two Koreas. South Korea was occupied by American forces and at the end of World War II, whereas North Korea was occupied by Russian forces and later under the influence of Chinese communism as well. The North invaded the South, you can see from the red arrows, pushed the South Korean forces almost completely into the sea. The United Nations, with the blue lines there, pushed the North Korean forces all the way through North Korea up to the Chinese border, which freaked the Chinese out, and the Chinese then poured their 1 million man army into North Korea. And then on the right panel you can see the communist forces of China as well as North Korea then pushing the Allied forces, the UN forces, south again. Eventually a stalemate was reached, and they essentially signed a ceasefire, and we call it now the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone, and there's been this ceasefire in place ever since. There is no peace treaty. Technically, the Korean War is still going on. The presidents of the United States during the Korean War were Harry S. Truman and Dwight David Eisenhower, who had gone from being a general in the United States military forces during World War II to becoming Supreme Allied Commander in World War II to becoming the first Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, and then when he retired he entered politics and became president in 1952. The military leader for the American forces on the ground was the same Douglas MacArthur. He, although, got into a difference of opinion, we'll call it, with President Harry S. Truman and was removed from his position. It's a very famous moment in American military history as well as the history between civilian-military relations. The foreign powers that the United Nations was fighting was the People's Republic of Korea, which we commonly call North Korea, and the People's Republic of China, which we commonly call China, or mainland China. The stated reason for the conflict was the defense of the Republic of Korea, which we call South Korea, and the end of the conflict was a ceasefire, and as I said already, there has not been a peace treaty signed. Within the same realm of the Cold War and under the concept of domino theory, President Eisenhower got us involved, us being the United States, in the Vietnam conflict because as Japan had expanded during World War II and before World War II, they had taken over these former French and British colonies under the espoused statement that they were driving out Europeans from Asia and protecting East Asians. However, it was just a replacement of one imperial power with another. At the end of World War II, France demanded its colony back, its colony of Indochina, which is Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. However, Ho Chi Minh, who had resisted Japanese intervention in Vietnam, now did not want to return to French rule as well and wanted a Vietnamese nationalism, Vietnam for the Vietnamese. He led a guerrilla war against the French forces. Ultimately, there was a partition, and Ho Chi Minh got a northern piece called North Vietnam, and a southern piece called South Vietnam was created as a French-supported pseudo-democracy. As the French forces were defeated, they had asked for American help. Americans sent advisors over under Eisenhower, and eventually advisors became soldiers, and eventually escalation and full-fledged military intervention. There's the battle map of the Vietnam War from 1964 to 1975. Purple is the North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh with a capital of Hanoi, and South Vietnam, and this map is green with a capital of Saigon. Essentially, the warfare was American intervention and escalation came because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which allegedly American naval ships were attacked by the North Vietnamese. We now doubt that ever happened. It was probably just an excuse. But that allowed President Johnson to send even more troops. The leader of American forces on the right there, General Westmoreland, is depicted. The North Vietnamese used this thing that you can see, this purple line, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, to send infiltration and to support guerrilla warfare support guerrilla warfare soldiers that were called the Viet Cong. And that's where a lot of the conflict happened. The worst year, an incident in the Vietnam War is called the Tet Offensive, where simultaneously all over South Vietnam, Viet Cong forces erupted, attacking Americans and South Vietnamese forces. Ultimately, in 1975, Richard Nixon withdrew the United States from Saigon, so it's often called a withdrawal or a strategic withdrawal, but the fact that the U.S. Embassy was conquered and taken over as the helicopters are taking off, if you use the expression, if it swims like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Well, if you're retreating and the other people are moving in, it seems pretty much like a loss to me. So in the Vietnam conflict, the presidents were Ike, JFK, LBJ, and Richard Nixon. The U.S. military leader through most of the war was General Westmoreland. The foreign power was North Vietnam, but they definitely had support from the People's Republic of China. The stated reason for the conflict was the defense of South Vietnam, as well as domino theory, and U.S. involvement in the war ended with the fall of Saigon and the U.S. withdrawal, and the war ended shortly thereafter. There was a negotiation between the United States under the leadership of Secretary of State Henry Kissinger in Geneva. It's called the Geneva Accords, and essentially once the United States withdrew, South Vietnam collapsed, and Vietnam today is a non-partitioned state, and it is still one of the few remaining communist states in the world. In the Persian Gulf War, American forces were responding to the invasion of Kuwait and sought to defend an ally. The fact that the ally controlled 25% of the world's oil, mere coincidence. And so even though the United States had allied itself with Iraq, particularly in the Iraq-Iran war, that the United States did not want Iraq to control even more oil by controlling Kuwaiti oil as well. So you can see it was a classic invasion and flanking attack to liberate Kuwait. The American forces did minimal intervention and invasion into Iraq proper, although there were many, many, many missile and air attacks. The President of the United States during the Persian Gulf War was George H.W. Bush, otherwise called Bush 41 or Bush Sr. The military leader for the Allied and American forces was Norman Schwarzkopf, there on the left of the picture. The foreign power was Iraq, And the stated reason for the conflict was the occupation of Kuwait. However, the problem I have with that is there are plenty of countries who are being occupied and have been occupied, and we don't do anything about it. For example, off the top of my head, Western Sahara has been occupied by Morocco for almost 40 years now. So there's clearly was something unique about Kuwait that led to us to get involved, and I think we all know that that was oil. The end of the conflict ended with the 1991 Gulf War ceasefire agreement, in which Saddam Hussein successfully tricked the United States into allowing him to have helicopters, which he then used to attack and gas the Kurds who had, in his mind, betrayed him by siding with the United States during the attack. I'm going to go back a slide and explain a little further. Up there in Kirkuk and Mosul and Erbil, which is the more Kurdish part of Iraq, the United States had promised the Kurds if they had turned on the Iraqi forces up there as a way to distract the Iraqi army, the United States would support their quest for Kurdish independence. Not only did we fall to Saddam Hussein's trick of allowing him to keep helicopters, we did not keep our word to the Kurds, and Iraq crushed Kurdish nationalism. Only now are the Kurds regaining some of their former power. They have an autonomous region in northern Iraq where they can control the profits of their own oil proceeds. And now, during the Syrian conflict, the Kurdish forces are some of the most allied soldiers to the American interests, as well as some of the finest fighters in the conflict. And in many ways, we owe it to the Kurdish forces for the fact that the Western coalition was able to defeat ISIS in 2017 and 2018. And finally, the last major of the 11 major conflicts in American history is the 2003 invasion of Iraq. It was quite controversial, to say the least. After the 1991 ceasefire, the United States maintained air superiority in what's called a no-fly zone over Iraq for a decade or so, under the presidency of primarily of Bill Clinton and a little bit of President President George W. Bush, Bush 43, or Bush Jr. Who knows what the real thing was it the fact that Bush 43 wanted to finish what his dad had started? Was it revenge for the fact that there was an Iraqi conspiracy to assassinate H.W. Bush? Was it were there weapons of mass destruction? Did President W. 43 Bush actually believe there were WMDs? We know now that there were no WMDs. The question has always been is whether it was a lie all along. Did we know all along there were no WMDs? Secretary of State Colin Powell, who had been the leader of American forces from Washington during the first Iraq War, later was the Secretary of State during the second Iraq War, and famously gave a presentation to the United Nations justifying the conflict, in which he lied. And he has regretted that since, but we also don't know, did he know he was lying at the time, and so on and so on and so forth. Regardless, the invasion happened. President W. Bush ordered the invasion. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld gave the daily briefings and explanations of it. The leader of American forces on the ground was Tommy Franks, who was also a veteran of the first Iraq War. The foreign power, therefore, was Iraq. There's Saddam Hussein in the upper left-hand corner. Again, the United States went into the northern Kurdish region with airborne forces to distract and weaken Iraqi forces. There were many bombing runs by Allied forces. The main American invasion route came out of Kuwait. The 3rd Infantry Division and the 1st Military Expedition Forces made a run towards the capital of Baghdad to seize the capital, while the British forces took over Basra, the second largest city in Iraq. It was a quick in and take over war, essentially. There were the major battles of Fallujah 1 and Fallujah 2, as well as other pitched battles, but generally speaking, It went pretty quickly as a conventional war. It's one of those situations where we won the war and lost the peace. 2006 was one of the bloodiest years of the U.S. Presence in Iraq, which the Iraqis call the U.S. occupation. And the United States did eventually capture Saddam Hussein, turned him over to the Iraqi provisional government, and he was put on trial and executed. But there are a lot of questions and unfortunately a lot of bad effects still of the destabilization of the region by the Americans with the invasion of Iraq. In many ways, ISIS was a product of the American invasion. Al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, was actually in an American prison at least once during the U.S. Presence in Iraq, and he later then formed ISIS and moved into western Iraq and eastern Syria. So the U.S. commander during the war, as I said, is Tommy Franks. There's two pictures of Tommy Franks, and there is President Bush, who was in the Oklahoma Air National Guard during the Vietnam War, landed on an American aircraft carrier in a flight suit, and famously declared mission accomplished. So again, to recap, President Bush, Tommy Franks, Iraq, alleged WMDs, weapons of mass destruction, and it ended with the fall of Baghdad on April 9th, 2003. In conclusion, war is hell, as William Tecumseh Sherman said. And there on the left is a picture of the U.S. casualties in these major conflicts. I think what always gets lost is that war means death. I mean, we know that, but we don't think about it. War means death on both sides. We also don't seem to recently understand that war costs money. Wars are expensive, both in terms of human life, infrastructure, and finances. Thank you for listening to this presentation. I hope it was interesting. Please continue to watch more presentations by this babbling, professing professor. Thank you.